There are literally hundreds of different bass fishing lures out there and probably just as many different techniques and presentations, but they all have one thing in common, and that is time in the zone. And by time in the zone, I'm referring to our lures. How often are they working for us? If we as anglers actually knew how little that our lures are doing what they're supposed to be doing, we'd probably be shocked, whether that's because we're hung up on a leaf, buried in vegetation, the lure is pulling up out of the depth we want. There's so many reasons. Well, here are 4 situations that anglers run across all the time and actionable tips to help keep your lures in the zone longer and therefore catch many more fish. First, let's go ahead and talk about lures that are on the bottom, whether we're dragging them or hopping them, baits that have that bottom contact. This is probably the presentation that we lose our efficiency more often than about any other because of lake debris and all these other situations that I mentioned earlier. So what can we do? Number one, like I talked about in the last video, is use larger lures. As more of the vegetation pops up, more debris pops up, when we use larger lures, that means more of the lure is apt to be visible more of the time. It's so often using tiny baits when we get a little bit of that vegetation or even some large rock crevices that it can fall down there to the bottom and completely vanish. We think that it is being seen, but so often it's completely invisible to the fish. Larger lures on the bottom can help eliminate that. And you can also use presentations that help keep the lure off the bottom just a bit. For example, a Tokyo rig. This is a tremendous presentation when you've got just a little bit of debris, muck, silt, whatever down there in the bottom. Even a rocky type of a situation, a Tokyo rig can keep that lure up and visible almost 100% of the time, and a larger weight will keep that lure down where you want it almost 100% of the time. Next is use a drop shot with an appropriate leader length. If you're vertical fishing straight down, maybe you've got some chara that's 8 to 10 inches, well then a drop shot leader around a foot's gonna work great. Maybe you're fishing around some bigger boulders, so possibly a longer leader is gonna help out. But adjust the leader on your drop shot so you can keep your lure up out of that stuff and visible to the fish more of the time. Number 2 is soft plastic lures that are fished horizontally in the water column. Think of your swim baits, your grubs, your swimming worm presentations, those types of things. So what tends to happen, especially if we don't get those long casts out there, is that lure starts to move up towards us sooner than we think. And if you're targeting a specific depth, okay, let's say you're just trying to keep that lure above the weeds, or you're trying to hit those mid depths, that lure is not in that zone that we want as long as we think. For those of you that are using active target, you've probably noticed this right away. The easiest way to rectify that situation is, as you're bringing that lure back, every once in a while pause and let it sink back down on a slack line. Get that lure back down there in the zone, and that is going to just increase the efficiency of that lure by so much, and you're going to get many more bites because of it. And the other thing that we can do using these swim baits, grubs, and swimming worms is when we're targeting a little bit deeper water, take the time to put that heavier weight on there. I know I am so bad at this. I like a 1/4 ounce, and I'll throw a 1/4 ounce all the time. Well, there's times I need to get that 3/8 or that 1/2 ounce. That heavier weight is going to make it much easier for us to keep that lure down there. A swim bait head is a perfect example. It's very easy to target those 20+ foot depths when you use a larger swim bait head. The next one is deep diving crankbaits. This is probably one of the most inefficient presentations that we can have when bass fishing because of the length of the cast. If you're using those big lures, those big build, big lift crankbaits, you've got to have really, really long casts because the crankbait is in the zone for such a short period of time. So make sure you throw way past your intended target and then bring it back towards it, and you're going to just completely transform your deep diving crankbait fishing. And the last one that I want to talk about is our surface lures, our topwater lures. We very much have to determine whether we're throwing to targets or not. And if you're throwing to specific things like isolated weed patches, working down a lay down, want it to sit around a dock, well, then you need to be choosing topwaters that can sit there. Your poppers, your frogs, even a walking bait to a degree, because you can pause it and leave it sit there. Now, if you're working larger weed beds, larger lengths of shoreline, you're trying to search for fish, then our efficiency is going to be picked up with those topwater lures that really cover water, your buzz baits, your whopper ploppers, and also your walking baits. So make sure that you don't choose a topwater just because it's your favorite lure. Choose a topwater because it's going to fit the situation and keep that lure in the zone the longest. And speaking of extra long casts, if you want to watch a video on all the different parts of making those extra long casts, go ahead and watch this one right here. And make sure that you go out and encourage someone today. You never know how you might just change their life. For the Bass Fishing Life, I'm your host, Steve Rogers.